Hiya guys, happy EDS and HSD Awareness Month. My name is Chronically Jenni and this is the last video in the 2021 Awareness Month video series from me. This time I wanted to talk about a more serious subject and really help raise awareness with those who are not aware of how difficult living with ehlers-danlos syndromes or hypermobility spectrum disorder can be. Because just getting diagnosed with it is really difficult. The average age for onset of symptoms is 12 years old and the average age for diagnosis is 24. That's 12 years it takes just to find some answers to the horrible symptoms that our bodies live with on a daily basis. So I've asked my very brave zebras from across the world to share a little bit about their diagnosis stories so you can get a true picture of what it takes to get diagnosed. Trying to get diagnosed and find answers when you're living in such severe pain can be so exhausting, especially when you have medical professionals who don't understand. It's so sad that it's such a common experience to be disbelieved, misdiagnosed and misunderstood by medical professionals who are meant to care about you and your pain management. Please listen to these stories and try and help us make a change, because it shouldn't take anyone this long to find answers.
I got diagnosed with EDS when I was 30, so 3 years ago, and it was a breath of fresh air. I remember crying when I got the diagnosis, because I'd been misdiagnosed with fibromyalgia for years. And a lot of people say that, you know, fibro is kind of just like something that the doctors tend to fob you off with if you come to them with too much pain, you know. And sometimes it does feel like that, you know, it does feel like they're a bit like, well, we don't really know what's wrong with you because you're just in a lot of pain, so we're just going to say that you've got fibro. But when a different doctor saw me and put two and two together and then got me sent off to see a specialist, and they pretty much diagnosed me on the spot. And then when I did more and more research about it and I realised this is absolutely me and always has been me, why has nobody ever looked into this before? Yeah, it really was a breath of fresh air. But just like grief, you go through a lot of different stages. It isn't just straight up acceptance and happy, joy. You know, there's relief. Well, this is what I went through. There's relief that you have a diagnosis that seems to fit a lot better. Then there is the sadness of thinking that, you know, things could have been better for you now had you known before. There's the anger that you were misdiagnosed in the first place. Then comes the grief, I think. The grief for the life that you once had when things start to get worse and there are things that you want to do and you can't do anymore. Yeah, it's like an ongoing grieving process for me personally. And then finally there's acceptance. And that's the stage that I'm kind of at now. I'm still grieving all the time, but I'm also accepting that this is what I have and this is what I need to deal with for the rest of my life. And yes, it may get worse. It already is getting worse, but like that may continue. So I have to make sure that I have lots of different aids and stuff like that in place to help me achieve the best life that I can. So yeah, that's my story.
It took me a number of years to get diagnosed with EDS. As you probably know, EDS is a lifelong condition and you've had it since birth. So I got diagnosed probably when I was about 18 or 19. I only started getting affected by it when I was 14 and I was diagnosed with ME first about a year later, and then it took a number of years to convince doctors that I had this condition because I researched it myself. Then I got my diagnosis and everything kind of fell into place from then on, all my comorbidities and everything else. So yeah, it took a long time for me.
So yeah, I've always experienced symptoms as a child, basically all my life. So I'd always be in pain, I'd be fatigued, have tummy aches and headaches and things like that. There was always like something wrong. And I always, because it was like so normal to me, I even found it difficult to communicate it to my mum. And when things got really bad for certain specific issues, we'd go to doctors, but it would be very like piecemeal reviews and nothing was collated into one whole picture. until I graduated university and started working in a really stressful job at a film production company, and neglected self-care for several years. And it was at that point that I had my neck and coccyx and pelvis subluxing to the point that I couldn't walk, that I actually Googled and managed to actually research and find out what ehlers-danlos syndrome was. And then I made an appointment to go to the London Hypermobility unit and got diagnosed by the rheumatologist there.
So back in 2018, I suffered from multiple spontaneous aortic and arterial dissections throughout my body. This went on for about a year, and we had no answers as to why this was happening. And then it was after a year, I had genetic testing, and that confirmed the diagnosis of vascular ehlers-danlos syndrome.
So my diagnosis with hypermobile EDS took around 2 years of active searching. You know, looking back over my life, I've had symptoms since I was a young child. I'd always get injured and bruises and sprains really, really easily. I'd be tired all the time and had a lot of really bad headaches from the age of kind of 10. I had growing pains, but it was all put down to puberty, even when I'd definitely gone past the age of getting growing pains. But I really actively started searching for answers when I was 18. And basically I started having daily headaches that were relentless and wouldn't go away. I had rheumatologists who MRI'd the wrong bits of me. I had one who told me I wasn't hypermobile, which was a surprise to me because being bendy in my elbows has always been my party trick since I was very, very young. So I definitely knew that wasn't the case. But I'd never heard of hypermobility spectrum disorder or ehlers-danlos syndrome at that time. So I kept going, and I kept going from neurologist to neurologist, and had one that I still remember look me in the face and point blank call me a drama queen and told me that there was nothing wrong with me. That still sticks with me today, even though it was 6 or so years ago now. So I ended up having to leave university because I needed to find answers. I couldn't carry on functioning the way I was. I started getting POT symptoms, not that I knew what that was at the time. And because I was spending so much time in bed with these headaches and these heart symptoms, the rest of my body started to decondition with it. I started having subluxations and more pain in my joints and just more pain generally. So I left university and was just extremely lucky to have private healthcare under my dad's work, which isn't super common here in the UK. And I picked a doctor at random and I went to see him, and he said, I don't know what's wrong, but I know someone who will. And I got sent to the National Hospital of Neurology and Neurosurgery in London and went to see a wonderful doctor there, and he basically diagnosed me with EDS, POTS and a CSF leak on the spot. These were things that no other doctor had seen up until this point, and I must have seen a dozen. You know, so coming out of that diagnosis, you'd think you'd feel, you know, upset because you've got this condition that is incurable and is difficult to manage and you're going to live with for the rest of your life. There's no quick fix. But actually, I was over the moon because I finally had some answers to these horrific symptoms that had been plaguing my life. And that only took me 2 years. And that's lucky. That shouldn't be lucky at all.
Per avere la diagnosi ci sono voluti 14 anni. I primi sintomi li ho avuti verso gli 11 anni, quando si lussavano da sole le clavicole, senza che nessuno gli desse importanza, perché tanto tornavano a posto da sole. Saranno dolori di crescita. Sono sempre stato imbranato negli sport di squadra e l'urto con il pallone mi provocava dolore. non fare il debole. Eh, Dopo i 20 anni ho cominciato ad avere problemi all'anca destra, e a quel punto mi sono intestardito a voler capire perché succedeva. Grazie ad una mia carissima amica che allora era studentessa di medicina e oggi è medico, ho cominciato ad indagare sulle sindromi di Ehlers-danlos e ho preso contatto con il centro Ehlers-danlos del Policlinico di Milano e ho fatto la prima visita. La diagnosi è stata una liberazione. Avevo ragione, non ero debole, pigro o ipocondriaco. Ora però dovevo e potevo cominciare a lottare.
I became a zebra in 2017 when I received an official EDS diagnosis. I was proud to finally have a diagnosis that made sense to all of the puzzle pieces we had been searching for over many years. There were many bumps in the road to getting a correct diagnosis, as I was misdiagnosed several times. The geneticist who diagnosed me basically told me that EDS was no big deal and that I would just have some issues with my joints. This is why EDS needs awareness. Having an EDS diagnosis is a big deal as it's crucial for us getting the help we need. My fight with EDS has definitely knocked me down several times, but I've continued to get back up as I am zebra strong.
35 years to get my hypermobile EDS diagnosis. The journey was a bumpy one, from teenage years up until in my 40s, seeing lots and lots of different specialists for individual items like my lungs, my heart, my joint pain, my headaches, an immunologist, all sorts of different people. And it took a long time until I actually, with my mast cell activation syndrome, someone recognized the symptoms of hypermobile EDS. So it was a long journey, but one that I'm actually very grateful to have reached in the end.
I was diagnosed with HEDS when I was 19 years old. It was not straightforward, and I travelled over 150 miles from where I live to get a diagnosis. I'm so grateful that I got my diagnosis when I did.
I first started showing symptoms when I was about 7. I remember complaining of my knees hurting and not being able to keep up with other people in PE and just thinking I was unfit, or people telling me that and me just believing that was true and not knowing any better. I didn't get diagnosed until I came to university, and I think it only took maybe about 6 months of going to doctors for them to originally diagnose me with HSD, even though I'd known something was going on for a lot longer than that, and had told doctors that things were going on, but it took me going to a doctor and saying, I think I have this, and I need this test for them to finally take me seriously and diagnose me.
What was my diagnosis story like? Well, I do have a video on that on my channel, which maybe Jenni will put here, but here's the Cliff Notes version. It took me 10 years. 10 years. I was born and raised vegetarian. So when I came into my doctor's office saying, I was dizzy a lot and low energy and having a lot of headaches and all of those really sort of vague beginning symptoms when I was in my late teens, early 20s or so, she informed me in no uncertain terms that it must be anemia because I had been a vegetarian my whole life, sent me for the blood test to prove that I was anemic, proved in fact that I wasn't anemic, and then dropped the whole thing 3 times in a row. Never looked beyond that. I had to do a lot of the research myself when I was living alone without a doctor and without insurance that would cover my own doctor abroad when I was living in Germany. Yeah, it was a drama. It was a big drama. So if you're interested, you can follow the link to my whole video. But yeah, it was intense.
It took me almost 7 years to get a diagnosis. I was sent over 10 hours away to specialty doctors. No one could figure out what was wrong with me. Multiple neurologists, multiple rheumatologists. And my pain started with migraines and extreme joint pain. I kept getting pushed from doctor to doctor, eventually ended up with a psychiatrist who told me that I had no pain, and that I was making it up for attention, and they weren't sure why my joints were dislocating or why I had heart pain at such a young age. They just kept passing it off to my age because I was only 17 at the time of my final diagnosis. So I finally got an ehlers-danlos specialty doctor that was located close to me to finally diagnose me based off the severe symptoms I was having, the lack of reaction to anesthetics, the joint dislocations, the heart issues, the GI issues. They all started lining up, and they all lined up with this disease. So then I started looking more into it after. Of course, we were looking into it before, but after I finally got a diagnosis, I was looking into it a lot more and found out that this is what I have.
I was 16 when I was diagnosed with hypermobile EDS. It was 2 years from the time that this was first mentioned as a possibility for me to the time that I received the official diagnosis. But I'd had problems with symptoms since I was a small child, so realistically I'd say it took 16 years to be diagnosed. My diagnosis journey started with a physiotherapist, actually. I was in physiotherapy because I had fainted from another rare genetic disorder that is unrelated to my EDS, and I had sustained a very bad ankle injury that just would not heal. I was in an air cast for over 8 months. It just would not heal. And upon examining me, she ran the hypermobility scale, and I was 9 out of 9. So she mentioned that, hey, I think you have EDS with your pain, your hypermobility, and your joint instability. Your ligaments are just extremely lax. So I want you to bring this up to your doctor. So I did. I brought it up with my pediatrician, and he sent in the referral to genetics, and that took about 2 years. And then I saw the geneticist and went over my entire life, basically my history, my family history, the usual things you go through with genetic disorders. And he diagnosed me officially with hypermobile EDS at 16. So it was just 2 years of wondering, not knowing what was going on, not knowing what, if any, treatment was needed, not knowing if this was really what was going on for me. So it was scary, and I felt very alone.
My diagnosis journey, I have been hypermobile since I was a child or a baby. I didn't walk till I was nearly 2. I was under the Portland and Great Ormond Street Hospital. They told my mum, oh, she'll walk eventually. Go home and do exercises, and was very blasé about the whole situation. Through my childhood, I was very bendy, very flexible, did all the gymnastics, did things that kids do. And it wasn't until I was an adult that things started to, get worse for me. And it wasn't until I had an injury at work when I was 30, I am now 35, that a physio said to me, oh, I think you've got ehlers-danlos syndrome. And I was like, well, what is that? I went home and did some research, and it took me about 3 years after that until I got an appointment at the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital in Stanmore, and I saw Dr. Helen Cohen, and she was the one that diagnosed me with HEDS B909, and 2 months after that I got diagnosed with fibromyalgia. So everything, all the symptoms that I had been experiencing with my stomach and my joints, it just all made sense.
And then it took me 7 years to get a diagnosis, and they were a horrible 7 years. I did a lot of crying, and I was very frustrated.
My pain started when I was 17, and I began actively looking for a diagnosis. Like many people, I saw a lot of different doctors. I was misdiagnosed twice, and but I went online. I found a community. I found people whose experiences were like mine, and I kept fighting to see a geneticist, and I kept fighting for a correct diagnosis, and I followed my instincts. And I was lucky enough that it took between 3 and 4 years, and not longer. Eventually, I pushed enough that I was able to find a geneticist who would take me. And the amazing thing is that in one appointment with that geneticist, I was diagnosed with POTS, I was diagnosed with mast cell activation syndrome, and I was diagnosed with ehlers-danlos syndrome. And then we followed up with the genetic testing to confirm that I had hypermobile EDS. And I had heard a lot of discouraging things from doctors before that. I had been told that an EDS diagnosis was worthless and that it wouldn't change my treatment plan. And when I finally got a correct set of diagnoses, it immediately changed my diagnosis plan and it immediately changed my quality of life. So I would encourage anyone who's in that long haul for diagnosis to keep persisting because it is worth it.
So I didn't get diagnosed with EDS until I was 25. I had been having symptoms since I was born, and we later found out that actually in my medical notes when I was a baby, a doctor had suggested that they thought I had a connective tissue disease, but nobody had told my parents and it didn't get passed through to my GP, and so nothing was ever said, which is slightly frustrating because, yeah, as I said, it took another 25 years to get that diagnosis. The journey was a really difficult one, quite a traumatic one. I started having the majority of my sort of symptoms when I was about 15, and for the next 10 years I went through various misdiagnoses. I had a lot of problems with my mental health because I wasn't being listened to or believed that I had physical symptoms. Ended up being sectioned, and yeah, it was not a good journey to diagnosis, and I think it has left me with quite a lot of medical trauma. But yeah, when I was 25, I finally found a GP who pretty much worked out what the issue was straight away. She had a friend who had EDS and she could see a lot of similarities between the two of us, so she referred me to a rheumatologist. They diagnosed me with benign joint hypermobility syndrome, which isn't actually a correct diagnosis these days. But I was then referred up to London, and then I was diagnosed with ehlers-danlos syndrome. And then when I had that diagnosis, I started being referred to other doctors and started getting other diagnoses like POTS and gastroparesis and things like that. So actually getting my EDS diagnosis was really important. I remember before I got diagnosed with EDS, a doctor had said to me that it didn't really matter if I had a diagnosis or not because it wouldn't change whether I had it and it wouldn't change my treatment. But actually for me, having a diagnosis has been incredibly important, both for my mental health but also to be able to see the right doctors to get other things diagnosed and to just understand what is going on with my body. So I think it's pretty widespread that this is a kind of journey that a lot of people go on. Everyone I've spoken to pretty much with EDS has had difficulty getting a diagnosis, and it's something that really needs to change.
It took me about 6 years to finally get a diagnosis of EDS from when my first obvious symptom arose. It was only about 2 years after this first symptom arose that an orthopaedic consultant suggested a condition called ehlers-danlos, which I had actually never heard of before I spoke to him. However, it's been a really difficult journey since then to even find a doctor who's willing to diagnose me or understands the condition. I was thankful enough to be referred to genetics who were able to rule out the other types of EDS and concluded that I suffered from the hypermobile type. However, I still face difficulties getting a GP or other consultants to understand my diagnosis or believe that I actually have hypermobile ehlers-danlos.
So I've been having issues with pain, joints, stomach issues, bladder issues, mental health issues, everything that kind of comes with hypermobile EDS since I was a child, and so I've been looking to find out what's wrong with me since then, and I got diagnosed at 23. So I would say it's been like searching for 23 years. However, once I learned about EDS, which was a couple of years ago, it took me about a year from learning about what EDS is, thinking maybe I have EDS, and then getting the diagnosis. The journey was fairly simple-ish for me. So I basically found out what EDS is, and I did that by logging onto like a disability forum, and I was getting to the point where I was really unwell. I was kind of in and out of hospital all the time, having all these different tests done, just not getting anywhere, not really getting any support or help. And I basically just put all of my symptoms onto a disability forum on Facebook, and somebody replied and was like, oh, have you looked into like EDS, because you've got lots of symptoms and that's what I have. I then went to the NHS and requested an appointment. I did get an appointment with a rheumatologist, but it was virtual because it was during COVID, and she didn't know what EDS was. She didn't really know anything about being hypermobile or anything. She kind of asked me really vague questions, and didn't really do like the normal criteria for EDS. So I left that appointment and was just kind of felt really let down and a bit like, I don't know what I'm going to do, and I was getting really desperate for a diagnosis. And I was really lucky to be able to save for a private appointment, and it was expensive, but it was kind of like the best thing that I've done. And I went in, saw a private doctor, had my diagnosis, and ended up scoring like 9 out of 9 on the criteria. And she was like, I don't understand how nobody's picked this up before. And then she actually moved my care onto the NHS, so I'm now on the NHS again, but I was just really lucky to have family that could help, and also my savings and things like that. So going private, the diagnosis and like journey was fairly smooth, but obviously expensive. But for me, I was just kind of had been searching for answers on the NHS and just wasn't getting listened to. So yeah, that was kind of my story. And then now back on the NHS and trying to basically get treatment for things, which we are getting there, but it takes time.
It took me 17 years to be diagnosed with EDS. We started looking when I was about 4 years old, and a paediatrician definitely saw there was something there, but wasn't sure what it was. Started looking again when I was in my teen years, and again, medical professionals, there's definitely some form of connective tissue disorder there, but we're not sure what it is. We just always called it in my family my muscle condition growing up. It wasn't until my early 20s that I was diagnosed when I saw a rheumatologist, and he diagnosed me with ehlers-danlos syndrome. So it was a long journey with some people believing me, others not, probably more than not than do believe me. But we got there in the end. I got my diagnosis, and as soon as I knew what ehlers-danlos was and looked it up, the puzzle pieces just fit and it made sense.
10 till 12 years. It took the doctors, the hospitals, whatever, everybody who was involved to find out I have ehlers-danlos type 3. Back in 2016 I finally got the diagnosis. After all those years of research, it wasn't an easy road. I have had a lot of different kind of researches they did on me, like blood examination, DNA examination, spear biopsy, that they took a bit of muscle out of my legs to research that, MRI scans, researches for your stomach with tubes and all kind of horrible things. But luckily, finally in 2016, I found out that I have ehlers-danlos type 3 by an amazing a doctor who is specialized in ehlers-danlos type 3, and he was my stomach researcher. I don't know the English word, but he found out. So I'm super happy that I finally got my diagnosis after all those years back in 2016. Although it was a really hard trip to get there, but now I know, and yeah.
When I was 7, I started having problems, but I put it all down to growing pains. So when I turned 11 and my knee dislocated for the first time, I was finally diagnosed with hypermobility syndrome. But it wasn't until a couple of years later that I was actually diagnosed with ehlers-danlos. But my journey is still ongoing. I've had gastrointestinal problems for years, but it was only recently that I was diagnosed properly with functional gastrointestinal disorder, one of the associated conditions with EDS.
So my journey getting diagnosed is a little bit different from everybody else, I expect. So I was diagnosed when I was 11 years old, but the journey till then was a long one. So I spent a lot of time in hospitals, physios, spent some time at Great Ormond Street Hospital, then trying to find out what was wrong with me. And then I was finally diagnosed in the early 90s. of course, the internet wasn't really around, so I had to try and find out what this condition is by books. And obviously, there's only little sections in books. So I sort of had to manage it and deal with it in my own way, to be honest with you. And that was my journey, really. So I've known I've had this condition from when I was young. And for me, it's actually a bit of a hallelujah moment, because I think getting diagnosed at a younger age is a lot better, because you can sort of like manage your life, if that makes sense, and I expect when you have to fight it all your life.
Diagnosis took a long time, I think around 10 years. I was 13 when I started having symptoms. Lots of doctors didn't think I had a real problem and said things like that I was just anxious about going to school, or that it was a fake disability. It made me feel really down. After a long time waiting and going through the diagnosis process, I was seen by rheumatology. This was the old criteria, around 2014. The man didn't think my hips were hypermobile, so tried to move them, and both hips dislocated. It was awful, but meant I got my diagnosis.
Me tardé aproximadamente 10 años en ser diagnosticada formalmente y ha sido un proceso en ocasiones cansado y frustrante, ya que muchas veces los médicos llegaban a minimizar los síntomas o a restarles importancia.
It took me quite a while to get diagnosed. It took me 8 years in total. I actually started my process when I was 8 years old, and I got my diagnosis when I was 16. But it started off with back pain, and it just progressed. And then I went to a physiotherapist. I got diagnosed with chronic pain, hypermobility syndrome, and chronic fatigue.
Thank you for listening to those stories. I really hope it's given you some insight into not just the difficulty living with these conditions, but also the difficulty getting diagnosed and treated and finding answers when you're in so much pain. If you're able to, it would really mean a lot if you could donate to an EDS charity I've linked to down in the description, so that you can help support people living with ehlers-danlos syndromes and hypermobility spectrum disorder into the future. Thank you so much for watching my 2021 EDS and HSD Awareness Month series. Please share our videos to help us raise even more awareness this month. If you've liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe. I'll see you soon for another video. Spoons and love. Thank you so much for watching this video. You can click on this screen to subscribe to my channel, head to my blog, or watch another video from this series, or find out more about my daily life in my weekly vlogs.